Music 292, Week 9, Part 2, Phrase Deviations and Analysis. Hello, class! In this video, we're going to take what we learned last video, and we're going to apply it to analysis of some extended portions of pieces. This is a fair bit different than what you did in 191, in that we're going to look at longer sections of pieces. Just to remind you, last video we talked about 4 types of deviations. We talked about extensions, which were added content in addition to our expected phrase segments. We talked about expansions, which were added content that stretches out a phrase segment. We talked about compressions that were deletions of an expected phrase segment. And we talked about contractions, which were the fact that a phrase segment is shorter in length than what we expect. So we're going to take those 4 concepts and we're going to try to locate those in a bunch of pieces. We're going to start with an example from Beethoven's String Quartet, Opus 18, number 1, first movement. So I'm going to ask you to listen to this music. So there's a couple things you probably noticed off this piece right off the bat. And first of all, you probably noticed that the top system sounded completely normal, sounded completely within your expectations. That's because it actually does fit a standard phrase model here. You also probably noticed that listening to the second system of music, that it didn't exactly conform to your expectations, that it seemed to about halfway through, and then it felt like it didn't end where it was supposed to. That's the sense you're going to get when you are working with phrase deviations, when one of these things is happening. So you can listen and use your intuition a lot of the times to help you narrow down, okay, well, is there something odd going on here, or is it just a standard phrase length? When we're trying to apply these concepts, both phrase models and deviations, to analysis, our first step is always going to be to identify our basic idea. We talked last week about the fact that we could use our properties for beginnings and endings to help narrow down where to start and end this thing. So have one more listen and try to identify what you think is the basic idea here. One of the things you're going to find different in this course is that there's actually multiple possible correct answers a lot of the time. And a lot of this will depend on how you are mentally conceptualizing the piece. It will also depend on other factors of how you listen. For example, if you're better at hearing orchestration than somebody else in the class, you might pick up on details that they don't pick up on, and vice versa. If you're a bass instrument player, then you're probably going to focus more on that than you are on some of the upper voices compared to a violinist. So what we're really looking for in this class is consistency in your answer. For a basic idea, I would say you could argue that it's either 2 bars long or 4 bars long. Most of you have probably indicated a 2-bar long length here, and I'll break that down in just a sec. But the 4-bar length is also possible if we want to conceptualize both of these systems as essentially participating in a single phrase model. There's pros and cons of each. Let's start by working through our 2-bar basic idea option. If I have 2 bars of basic idea, that sets up a proportion I'm going to expect for the remainder of my phrase model. I want the other units to be 2 bars, or if they're fragments, to be half that length. So I can use that as kind of my starting point for figuring out the other segments. If I take a look at the next 2-bar unit, bars 3 and 4, I can see that this repeats the rhythm and the contour of the original thing, so we're also going to call this a basic idea. If I take a look at the third 2-bar portion, bars 5 and 6, I can see that it retains a very similar melody, but that the accompaniment starts to change. And I also see that that melody morphs a little bit in the second bar of the pattern. And so I probably want to call this thing some form of basic idea because I still recognize that rhythm and contour. But there's enough differences here that I'm going to actually tack on the word like onto the ending of it to show that. We're going to use this like a lot when things don't 100% conform to our definitions. because it's going to give us a place to basically talk about what the differences are compared to our expectations. Anytime you're putting like on something means it doesn't quite meet your expectations. And then finally, we see that bars 7 and 8 are quite different than any of the preceding content. It's got half notes now, it's got a change of contour, and it's coming to a long note essentially in bar 8. So all of that is suggesting that this is contrasting material. So if I put all these together, BI, 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 CONI, this is one of our hybrid phrase models. I can also check out the harmony and verify that I have a cadence to conclude my phrase here. Phrases and cadences match with each other. And in fact, it does. So if I break down the harmony, I can see that I've got some tonic to start, I move into more of a subdominant area, and then I finish with a cadential 6/4 to create a half cadence. If I was to understand this as a 4-bar basic idea, well, I'm going to frame out my other segments a little bit differently. A 4-bar basic idea is suggesting an expectation of 4-bar segments as we continue. So that means the material afterwards would probably be grouped in 4 bars. In this particular case, because I'm looking at the entirety of the 4 bars, only one out of those 4 bars is similar to our basic idea. And so because of that, I'm actually more likely to call it contrasting idea. But I'm going to tack on the like again in this case because it doesn't completely meet our expectations for contrasting because of that similarity in the first bar of the segment. A BI and then a CONI might be setting up something like a larger scale period structure. So whichever of those two options that you choose, you're going to continue with going into our second half. Okay, looking at the second system. If I was to continue with my 4-bar basic idea, I might notice that in my second system, the first 4 bars actually repeat bars 1 to 4 that we had above. So I'd call that the same thing. I would call it basic idea. If I was working with the 2-bar basic idea, again, because I'm noticing it's the same content, I would probably frame out the same basic idea. In the same way that bars 1 to 4 were 2 basic ideas, the 2 first units of the second system would also be 2 basic ideas. Take a minute now that we have that reference point to try to analyze the remaining content of the second system. Let's have a listen to just this passage. So from bar 9 to the completion of our example. Pause the video and map out your segments. All right, you probably had some difficulty in mapping out your segments here because you had too many things. There was more content than what you expected. You heard your phrase start with 2 basic ideas. You then heard a similar idea come in that had the same rhythm and contour again of the basic idea. I'm going to temporarily call those basic idea like, but I'm going to modify my analysis as we start to get more information here. And then to conclude the thing, we had something that very clearly had a cadence, but we're not sure whether to call it CONI or CATI yet, just because we don't know what phrase model this is participating in. With all the basic idea-like material suggesting possibly it's the hybrid that's basic idea, contrasting idea, but we haven't quite confirmed that yet. Some of you might have instead heard this as fragmentation happening in the middle, because it does take that basic idea and uses only the first bar of it rather than the 2-bar combo. In this situation, though, we have these gaps between the things that would typically be the fragments. So once again, we would need to use our concepts of deviation to be able to account for that. Neither one of these is wrong, but it's going to change how we account for the extra content. So I think for the sake of argument in this video, I'm going to choose the upper of the 2 options. One thing we might want to check before we proceed with anything else in our analysis is to verify where we think the phrase ends. So once again, we can look for a cadence because we know that cadences often indicate phrase endings, and then we can outline where that thing occurs. So very handily for you in this video, the phrase and the cadence happen at the end of the example. And I can double check the harmony to make sure that's right. So we've got this zone essentially where we definitely have some sort of extra stuff here. But the question is, what out of this do I choose to be the extra stuff? For a phrase model, I'm going to need probably BI, another segment, and then a CONI or CATI. So of these 3 things I've highlighted in blue, which do I consider the extra and which do I consider the one that still participates in the phrase? Well, it tends to be that we don't realize something is extra until it's happened too many times. So it will tend to be the later portion of the extra stuff that we will hear as extra. We need that reference that it's happening too frequently. So that's suggesting my first BI like is probably going to be part of my phrase content, whether I call it BI like or whether I call it frag like. In terms of extra content, it appears here we have added segments. And these added segments are occurring prior to our PAC. And so because of that, we're going to call this thing an extension because it's extra segments. And because it occurs before the PAC begins, we're going to call this thing a pre-cadential extension. One thing I want to mention here is that pre-cadential extensions often include either a repetition of previous segment material or else extreme contrast compared to the previous segments. And this example is pretty consistent with that. We're hearing the BI thing happening 2 extra times. All right, let's do another example. So I've given you some of the concepts that we've applied so far. I've left them on the left-hand side here for you. Your process is going to be that you're going to identify your basic idea. You're going to look for further segments of these phrase models, and then you're going to decide what is extra or missing based on your phrase model expectations. So let's have a listen to this piece, pause the video, and try to take a preliminary stab at following through these steps. You probably noticed in working through this that you were able to identify a basic idea pretty easily. The rest in particular in the upper voice is going to help you in framing that thing out. But you probably then had a bit of trouble framing out what was happening with the remaining phrase model segments. In particular, you noticed probably that you either didn't have enough stuff or that this thing didn't look long enough. You also probably had some trouble trying to frame this thing out in terms of what kind of phrase model it worked out to be. And it turns out there's actually a number of different options here. I actually want to focus less on phrase model this time around. And I want to talk more about what's happening harmonically here, because the harmony can sometimes give us hints about what's happening in terms of extra or missing content. The phrase models, too, can be sometimes way too distorted to give us useful information. So I'm going to start by thinking about how I might want to frame out the segments themselves based on properties of beginnings and endings that I'm seeing here. And this is probably how I would mark this thing out. I would say there's a 2-bar basic idea, there's another 2-bar unit that goes to the next rest, and then there's a 2-bar unit to conclude. So the rests are helping me divide that up, but the other thing that's helping me to establish is the repetition. You'll notice the third out of these segments repeats the melody that started the second of these segments. You might remember repetition is something that signals beginning. What's a little bit weird in this example, though, is that the repetition isn't just happening in one segment. It actually happens starting at the B flat in the 4th bar, continuing through the next 2 bars. And that's the exact same melody as we saw the 2 bars earlier, at the ending of the first segment and the beginning of the second segment. So I can't just take out a full segment and say that that thing is extra, because I'd be essentially splitting up 2 different segments in doing that. There's a particular kind of deviation that happens in this situation. And knowing a little bit more about how extensions work might help us to figure this out. The 3 extension types have certain properties that are associated with them. Like we just talked about in the previous example, pre-cadential extensions often involve extra repetition or contrast. Mid-cadential extensions involve evaded cadence. And in order to see whether that's happening here, we're going to need to do a harmonic analysis to see if any of the chords are suggesting that there should be a cadence. A post-cadential extension is going to involve harmonic prolongation. And once again, we're going to need to do some harmonic analysis to see if that's happening or not. So let's take a minute and put in our Roman numerals here. Pause the video, work out your Roman numerals, and then resume. So you should have had something that worked out to look somewhat like this. You're starting in F major, you've got a tonic prolongation at the beginning, you have a subdominant and a dominant with a cadential 6/4 that's trying to set up a cadence. I'm going to emphasize here, cadential 6/4s almost always try to trigger cadences. But what's weird here is that your cadential 6/4 doesn't resolve the place that you want it to. If this is a cadence, it should go 5/1. And instead of doing that, it goes 5/4. So this is a moment where it's thwarting your expectations. you keep on following the progression, though, it does keep on doing TSDT. We've got SDT of the 4 to 5 to 1, another SDT to conclude the piece for the 2, the 5 with the cadential 6-4, and the 1 chord. And this time, the cadential 6-4 resolves the way that we want it to. So the thing that's out of place here is the weird harmonic function order. We expect TSDT order. In this case, we're getting TSDS. And as I emphasized already, cadential 6-4 should be associated with cadences, but the cadence doesn't complete itself here. This is exactly what an evaded cadence is. This idea that you get a cadence set up, but it doesn't complete the way that you want it to. Evaded cadences will trigger the start of a mid-cadential extension. So at the moment where we resolve to the thing that is not the thing we expect, we put our start bracket. At the moment we finally finish our correct 5 to 1 for the final cadence, that's where we put our closing bracket for our mid-cadential extension. Easiest way to remember it is that your bracket's always going to go after the 5. It goes after the 5 of the evaded cadence, it goes after the 5 of the real cadence. Let's have one last listen to this thing and see if we can hear that kind of fake out cadence moment at that evaded cadence. Once again, we should be able to take scissors to this mid-cadential extension, cut it out, and the remaining material will create something that resembles a normal phrase model, or a normal phrase length. And that would be true in this case. It would be 4 bars long. Let's listen to the example. So with mid-cadential, it's less about how the segments are organized, and it's more about that moment of evaded cadence. I want to take a quick aside to talk about evaded cadences as a theory concept. Evaded cadences occur when we have the setup for a cadence, something like a strong dominant chord, for example, but particularly cadential 6-4 chords. But then we don't have the realization of the cadence. Evaded cadences can occur in one of 3 ways. The one you're most familiar with coming out of 191 is the deceptive cadence, or the deceptive progression. The deceptive cadence is a 5-chord moving to a 6 chord. But I'm using this more general term deceptive progression because there's other places it can go as well. Sometimes you'll see, for example, 5 moving to 4, like we just saw in our previous example. Evaded cadences can occur for 2 other reasons, though, one of which is a weakened harmonic progression. And this occurs when chords are weakened through something like an inversion, or maybe other features such as the orchestration. So if you had, for example, a 5-chord in first inversion going to a 1-chord in first inversion, you're more likely to hear that as a weakening, and you're more likely to hear that as an evaded cadence. Lastly, evaded cadences can be triggered by melodic continuation. Basically, the melody keeps going. And so because of that, we don't have a break that really signals a feature of ending. So all 3 of these may come into play, or only one of these could come into play. Evaded cadences vary quite a bit. All right, let's take a look at another example. We're going to follow the same 3 principles. We're going to identify our basic idea, look for further segments of phrase models, and decide what is extra or missing based on our phrase model expectations. Let's have a listen to this example. So what is your basic idea? Well, In this case, the 2-bar length is probably pretty logical. We've got very similar kind of rhythms in the first 2 bars, and then we have a change to more 8th note rhythms and 16ths in the next 2 bars, and also a shift to staccato articulation. And because of those changes, different rhythm, contour, and articulation, we're going to call this second segment a contrasting idea. Comparing to our next material, you'll notice this is exactly the same as bars 1 to 2. So we're going to also call bars 5 to 6 a basic idea. And then lastly, bars 7 to 8 are once again contrasting. They shift to 8th notes, they have some staccato articulation, and the contour is different. So far, this looks exactly like what we would expect for a period. But we seem, after we've completed our period structure, to have extra stuff that looks different, especially in its rhythm. We now have 16th notes in our accompaniment for the very first time, and we have a mix of quarter notes and other values happening in our melody, which we didn't really have in the previous material. So what I would suggest next for this one is map out the harmony in order to locate the cadences and phrase endings, just to verify that this thing is a traditional period structure. Don't forget, with periods, we're looking for our weak cadence and then our strong cadence for each of the 2 halves. Pause the video to analyze the chords now. Ready? All right, so your harmony should look something along the lines of this. I think it's probably easier here to focus on some of the harmonic function that's happening. We can see that we start the phrase with a tonic, we move to a subdominant in bar 3, and then we have a dominant in bar 4. And this is essentially arriving at a half cadence. We then have a very similar kind of progression for the second half, tonic for the next 2 bars, subdominant in bar 7, and then a dominant to tonic in bar 8. And that's a PAC. That's just a regular old PAC cadence. The extra stuff that we have completes 2 TSDT progressions, and it completes them pretty quickly. So this is telling us some information. It's telling us where the phrases go because they're going to line up with the cadence endings. It's also giving us some possibilities for how to consider the last 3.5 bars of material. This extra stuff at the ending, what do you think it might be doing here? Well, there's 2 possibilities that really come to mind. It could be extra stuff in terms of an extension, or it could be a brand new phrase. How do you tell the difference between these things? Well, you'll notice a few particular features about this passage that might help you in determining that. Number 1 is that melody in particular repeats a lot, as does the rhythm in the left hand. The harmonies move really quickly, so this thing could be a mini TSDT rather than an entire phrase comprising TSDT. And lastly, your melody is not particularly interesting. It's comprised of small repeated chunks, and it doesn't have a huge variety in terms of where it's going, and it's kind of very angular. What I mean by that is it's changing direction a lot. So it's not really something that I would call a lovely singable melody. It turns out these are actually features that are common with postcadential extensions. Postcadential extensions often feature repetition. They often feature harmonic prolongation of a cadential arrival chord. And in fact, that is part of the definition of postcadential extension. You need that prolongation to be present in order to be able to hear that. And lastly, they very commonly use fragmentation or the repetition of smaller ideas. So breaking down stuff that you've heard already or reusing maybe rhythms, for example, that you've seen elsewhere in the piece. So these are things that you can look for to help you make the decision. You need the prolongation, but the other 2 are fairly common in postcadential extensions as well. All right, I have one last example for you, and we're not going to complete this on this video. I'm going to get you started here, and then we're going to do the second half of it in the live class. You'll see why when we get partway through the example. I want to start by saying to not be fooled. This is not an F major, despite the key signature. So this example is actually from partway through the piece. It's from bar 70 of this particular piano sonata. And by this point, the whole piece is actually modulated already to C major. And you'll notice if you take a look at the score, every single B is a B natural instead of a B flat. So be aware of that. If you're looking at examples that aren't the start of the piece, it's possible that your key signature may not exactly match what's happening in the actual music. You might have to look for other accidentals. All right, let's have a listen to this passage. want you to start actually by analyzing the harmony. This is the opposite order compared to how we've done it on the previous examples, but it's going to tell you some useful information. So it's in C major. I want you to work until the beginning of the third system. Pause the video and get that done now. All right, what you have should look something along the lines of this. Let's try to find a basic idea here. Well, you probably noticed right off the bat that the basic idea was 2 bars long. And the reason for that is it repeats over and over again at that 2-bar length. What we see in bar 3, for example, is just a slight rhythmic variation of what we had in bar 1. So we can essentially call our first 2 bars a basic idea, the next 2 bars another basic idea. Let's map out other segments in comparison to that. Well, one of the things you probably noticed when you did your harmonic analysis is that you've got a cadential 6/4 happening in your next bar, in bar 5 of this example. Cadential 6/4s are signaling cadences. And so that's going to tell us something about our expectation for the total phrase length here. If this is a cadence, which it is because it's a cadential 6/4 that then goes to a 1 chord, then we know our phrase is ending. And I've marked that in with a blue phrase marking on top here. That tells us that we actually only have room for one more segment in this example. We don't know if it's a con eye or a cat eye yet because we don't know which phrase model we're referencing, but it's pretty clear based on the length established by the basic idea that this is going to be 2-ish bars long. I say ish because we actually we have a little connecting motive, a linking motive, which takes over the rest of the bar after the cadence. So something's missing here. And when we have an entire segment that's missing, you might remember that that's an example of a compression. So for our labeling, we're going to put an arrow in to show where the stuff is missing. We're going to call it a compression, and then we're going to indicate what is missing. If we think this thing is a sentence model, then it's the fragmentation that's missing. If we think this thing is a hybrid, it's probably the third BI that's missing. Both of these answers are correct. It all depends on what you see as the reference pattern. We don't have enough information in this phrase alone to be able to determine that, but maybe there was something earlier in the piece that set up a so-called correct sentence, for example, that then suggests when this material comes back, it should be analyzed this way here. If you don't have enough information to determine it, feel free to put both options. It does work out, though, that there is another way of analyzing this music. And that is that we don't necessarily have to have a 2-bar basic idea, particularly since there's some pretty prominent repeating content here. Let's have a listen to these first 2 systems again. In listening to this, it wasn't visually apparent to you, but you probably noticed that bars 1 to 4 of this example are actually repeated a couple bars later, which I've highlighted in yellow here. They're up the octave, so visually you're not going to clue into that right away. But if you're listening, you can tell that it's the same melody. Octave differences don't make a difference when it comes to analysis. And so because these are the same melody, we might want to call them both basic idea as repetitions of one another. In comparison to that, the stuff that we have in the remaining bars is different. It doesn't necessarily repeat the same melody. It's got a descending contour. And so it would make sense to call that thing a contrasting idea. But in this case, it's shorter than what we would expect. If we have a 4-bar basic idea, we're expecting a 4-bar contrasting idea. But in this case, it's only 2 bars long before our next basic idea comes in. So if you were understanding a 4-bar basic idea, if that's the thing that you were hearing, you would label a contraction here, in other words, a squishing of a segment, rather than a compression, a missing segment. Again, it's all about your understanding and your perception of the music. You can't mix and match them, though. You have to basically choose the one that's consistent with your length of basic idea. So we're going to continue with this piece more in the live class. I'm going to ask you which of these 2 basic idea lengths you prefer, the 2-bar or the 4-bar. And then we're going to go on to work on the remaining 3 systems. You might find it really useful if you actually go and analyze the harmonies ahead of time to save us some time doing the class analysis. I'm also going to talk a little bit more about the idea of having multiple correct answers in this class and sort of how I'm going to grade based on that. Because there's always a little bit of worry and confusion around things when it starts to get gray, when you're not just dealing with like an absolutely right or an absolutely wrong answer anymore. You're also going to take a look at two very short examples on perusal, which are easier than this one, with the idea that I just want you to work through your three concepts of finding your basic idea, mapping out as many segments as you can, and then confirming your expectations or seeing what goes against your expectations, and then mapping deviations based off that. One is going to be the Mozart Piano Sonata K279, and the second example is going to be a Haydn String Quartet Opus 76 No. 5. They're both very short examples, and they shouldn't take you a huge amount of time. They're a very straightforward presentation of a phrase deviation. Thanks for watching. I'll see you in the live class.